Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by OraSure Technologies and AWSI. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy-to-administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. Oral fluid-based testing products provide a simplified collection process, faster results, cost savings with minimal risk of tampering, and dramatically reduced risk of adulteration. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, and opiates. It was ranked as the #1 recognized brand name in oral fluid testing in a 2015 National Drug Testing Industry Survey. With a fast and easy-to-administer collection process, Intercept is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, and clinical setting screening programs, among others. Advanced Workplace Strategies Incorporated offers a complete package of employee and applicant screening services, including drug and alcohol testing, background checks, and other key verifications and assessment services. As a trusted partner of major U.S. and internationally based companies in a wide variety of industries for over 20 years, AWSI exceeds expectations by offering innovative services, superior customer support, and personalized approach to meet clients' research, investigative, and background check needs. Today's presentation is entitled, What You Should Know About Lab-Based Oral Fluid Testing, and will be presented by Bill Current and Dennis Kearns. Bill Current is the president and founder of the Current Consulting Group, a national consulting firm that specializes in drug testing policy development and providing accurate and up-to-date state drug testing law information. He is the publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com and the publisher of the e-newsletter State Drug Testing Laws Monthly and the weekly e-news service Drug Testing in the News. Dennis Kearns has over 25 years experience in the drug alcohol testing industry, including laboratory and international TPA executive management. He has extensive experience in business development, sales, operations, training, and merger and acquisitions. He is considered an industry expert in domestic and international policy development, DER, and supervisor training, as well as DOT and non-DOT program auditing. Mr. Kearns joined the Current Consulting Group in 2014. He focuses on employee and supervisor training, including custom on-site employee and supervisor training, focusing on reasonable suspicion. He also provides international drug testing diagnostics, which includes evaluation, project scope, and implementation management of an international drug testing program for employers and TPAs. It will now be our pleasure to hear from Bill Current and Dennis Kearns.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome to everyone who has joined today's webinar. First, I'd like to acknowledge and express appreciation to OraSure Technologies and AWSI for co-sponsoring today's webinar presentation. And also, I'd just like to welcome my co-presenter, Dennis Kearns. Dennis joined the Current Consulting Group the year before last, and I've known Dennis for many, many years. Really excited to have him as part of the Current Consulting Group and on today's presentation. There are very few people in our industry who can even begin to approach the level of expertise that Dennis has accumulated over the years. And there's no one in the industry who knows more about drug testing in Canada, for example, than Dennis. So I'm going to take us through the beginning part of the presentation, and then we're going to get to Dennis's part, and then we've got a conclusion afterwards. And I encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A function on the screen in front of you. We will entertain any questions that you have. We're happy to entertain questions about issues that we don't talk about today. Anything that you want to talk about, please feel free to submit those questions. So sort of set the foundation for today's presentation. And I got accused of this one time. I was giving a presentation, and somebody in the audience complained that I seemed to be biased toward drug testing. And I have to confess that I am, and that's probably no surprise. I've been in this business for over 25 years, and when I give presentations on drug testing, I'm talking about the advantages and the benefits of a drug testing program. And there's lots of different ways that you can do drug testing, especially nowadays. When I first got into this industry, it was lab-based urine testing, and that was it. Today there are alternative and advanced testing methods that, depending on the circumstances, may make a lot of sense. Today we're going to talk about lab-based oral fluid testing, one of the advanced testing methods that's available to employers and other organizations that do drug testing. And in particular, I'm going to share some information about some new regulations that will be coming out soon from the federal government. But before I do that, let's just review sort of the traditional lab-based urine testing process. You collect a sample at an off-site collection site, you transport it to a lab, there's a preliminary screen to determine whether there's any of the tested for drugs in the system, and if it's non-negative, it gets confirmed with usually with a gas chromatography mass spectrometry confirmation test. The result is then reviewed by an MRO to verify that it's accurate, and then it gets reported. And every step in that process involves time and money. And there's no way around that. Drug testing costs time, and if you want to get, a reliable, legally defensible result, then you've got to go through a laboratory to get at least a confirmation, if not the initial screen result, so that you can have some assurance that the results of the test that you're dealing with, that you're making an employment decision based on whether it's to hire somebody or to fire somebody, is based on a reliable, accurate test result that you can defend if that result is ever challenged. And this process takes time, and there's money involved in that. There are a number of advantages to lab-based oral fluid testing that are resonating within the drug testing industry right now. There are simply employers out there who will not do drug testing because they're just sort of opposed to urine testing. Urine testing is, especially if it's done through a certified laboratory following certain protocols that have been established over many years and that are required by either state laws or federal government agencies, is a very accurate way to do drug testing. But there are some people who are opposed to urine drug testing. It's subject to drug test cheating, adulteration, switching and swapping, and all kinds of different things. Oral fluid testing is not subject to the traditional cheating methods, and I've got some information, some detailed information coming up on that. And if we're talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, we're talking about an accuracy level that is exactly the same as lab-based urine testing. They're just sort of mirror images of each other in terms of accuracy, and I've got some information coming up on that. But the bottom line is it just takes less time to do an oral fluid test. So, when you look back at this process here, collecting at an off-site facility where that might take an hour or 2 or 3 hours, and the cost involved in it, well, with oral fluid testing, for some employers who are willing to do those collections on site, that goes away because the oral fluid testing process is so much simpler and easier to do. Now, we conduct an industry survey every year here at the Current Consulting Group, and we've been doing it since 1999. One of the questions that we've been asking over the last several years has to do with oral fluid testing, because in 2005, the federal government looked at allowing lab-based oral fluid testing, then they pulled back. Now there are proposed regulations out there that we're anticipating will come out in a final version here in the next month or 2 or 3. And so some of the comments that have been provided in our industry survey have referenced the day when the federal government will endorse lab-based oral fluid testing. And it's always sort of along the lines of what you see on the screen here. When the federal government approves lab-based oral fluid testing, when it's part of 49 CFR Part 40, when SAMHSA endorses it, et cetera, then we're really going to see it take off. And now we're at that point. We're at that point now where these proposed guidelines came out, the industry and the public had an opportunity to comment on them, and now we're awaiting, not any day now, but any time now, a final version of those regulations. And I've got some slides coming up to take you through that. So we're now at that point where years ago people said if it's ever approved by the federal government, if it's ever endorsed, if it ever becomes part of 49 CFR Part 40, then we're really going to see lab-based oral fluid testing take off. We're now at that time. We're at the time when a lot of people thought would never happen, that the federal government would never expand into other testing methods. Now we're there. And so a lot of companies have been looking at doing lab-based oral fluid testing. According to our survey, providers have been seeing an increase in lab-based oral fluid testing and interest in lab-based oral fluid testing. And now we're to the point where a lot of companies are really taking it very seriously. And it's reflected in the survey. So one of the questions we asked is, what percentage of all drug tests are oral fluid tests? And this is a survey of hundreds of companies in the drug testing industry. And as you can see, 5% or less, about a quarter of the industry said that. But between 5% and 10%, almost 30%. Now, when we first started doing this survey back in 1999, oral fluid testing, whether we're talking lab or instant result, didn't even register in the survey. It was years before people even started mentioning it as one of the trends that was up and coming. But as you can see now, based on our most recent survey, and we do this every year, 30% of the industry says the sales of oral fluid is between 5 and 10% of all drug tests, and almost 10% said it's between 10 and 15%. Over 8% said it was between 15 and 20%. You add all of that up, that's a lot of companies now selling lab-based oral fluid testing. How did sales in 2014 compare to 2013? That was the last time we asked that particular question. Between those 2 years, in 2014, we saw 12.8% say sales were up considerably, and 24% said sales were up modestly, for a total of 37% indicating that sales of oral fluid tests were up between 2013 and 2014. So we're seeing movement. It's heading in that direction. It's an upward trend that we're looking at. And these proposed guidelines from the federal government, which came out on May 12th of last year, have really started to increase the level of interest in lab-based oral fluid testing, because now potential buyers and resellers of lab-based oral fluid testing have this assurance that the federal government is behind it, even if you're not doing it under some type of federal mandate. The proposed guidelines came out May 12, 2015 in the Federal Register. There was a 60-day public comment period. A lot of comments were submitted. I've done a whole presentation just on the comments that were submitted. But the bottom line is that these proposed guidelines will establish standards for how oral fluid collections take place, for the devices, the collection devices themselves, the initial screening process, the confirmation testing process, the role of the MRO, the medical review officer, and then there were specific requirements that apply to federal agencies. There's a lot in those proposed guidelines, but one of them, and I'm going to take you through some of the things that were said, but one of the most important things I saw when I read those proposed guidelines is that last bullet. Quote, these proposed oral fluid mandatory guidelines, that's what OFMG stands for, provide the same scientific and forensic supportability of drug test results as the mandatory guidelines for federal workplace drug testing programs using urine. So in other words, the federal government has gone to such length to make sure that these proposed guidelines, that once they're finalized, they will be as reliable and scientifically supportable as the urine testing guidelines that the federal government has used for many years and which many states defer to as far as their state drug testing laws go. Initially, these proposed guidelines will only apply to federal agencies. It will be some time, as you see there, before DOT and the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, adopt the guidelines and decide to allow for oral fluid testing. But we know that day is coming as well. And when it does, when DOT adopts lab-based oral fluid testing, these are the guidelines that they will use. It's mandatory for DOT to use 49 CFR Part 40, and 49 CFR Part 40 will be including these lab-based oral fluid testing protocols, and they'll apply to the NRC and other agencies as well. Now, for some years now, I've been doing presentations on lab-based oral fluid testing, and a lot of people have heard me give these presentations, and it's sort of the gospel of oral fluid testing according to Bill Curran. What's really nice about the proposed guidelines that came out is that SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, articulated themselves what they believe to be the benefits of lab-based oral fluid testing. In other words, in the federal government's own words, they are essentially making the argument for why they've decided after all these years to allow lab-based oral fluid testing in addition to urine testing. And it has to do with the accuracy, the practicality, and the legality of using lab-based oral fluid testing in addition to lab-based urine testing. And I keep saying lab-based oral fluid testing. I just want to clarify that we're not talking about instant result oral fluid testing today. That's not part of the proposed guidelines from the federal government. And all that you read in those proposed guidelines and in these final regulations that are due out, any time now, has to do with lab-based oral fluid testing. So I'm just going to take you through some of the highlights real quickly. Incidentally, everybody on today's call is going to get a copy of these slides. You'll receive an email from Jessica, and she will send you the slides from today's presentation. There are a lot of slides. We're not going to talk to all of the slides today. There just isn't enough time. But there's a lot of good information that I thought you would like. And so even though I may skip past a few slides today, you're going to get all of these slides. And then if you have any questions even after the webinar when you're going through the whole slide deck, feel free to email us and let us know. Productivity was really one of the main reasons, one of the main benefits that SAMHSA underscored when they put together the proposed guidelines. And let me just read part of this. Productivity for federal agencies related to drug-free workplace programs is expected to improve when they switch from urine to lab-based oral fluid testing. For example, administrative data indicates it takes on average about 4 hours from the start of the notification of the drug test to the actual time a donor reports back to the work site. 4 hours, that's a long time. Different companies have different experiences, but that's a lot of downtime. Continuing, since oral fluid collection does not have the same privacy concerns as urine collection, on-site collections are likely, thereby reducing the time a donor is away from the work site. The department estimates the savings to be between 1 hour, in other words, dropping it to 3 total hours, and 3 hours, in other words, allowing for 1 total hour. We have done our own estimation of that, and we find that in the workplace, once an employee is notified to report to, say, the HR department or the medical department or wherever to provide an oral fluid sample, the total time that they're away from their work is typically far less than an hour. So you can see the productivity being affected in a very positive way. As far as the science goes, there are a number of studies that are quoted in the proposed guidelines. I won't take a lot of time on that, but the scientific basis for the use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has been broadly established, quote unquote. Drug test cheating was another major area that the federal government highlighted in articulating all the reasons why they were allowing lab-based oral fluid testing. And I've got some wonderful slides coming up on that, but basically what the federal government was saying is that all of the traditional drug test cheating methods that are out there just simply do not translate to oral fluid testing. It's almost impossible to dilute an oral fluid sample in somebody's mouth when the administrator of the test is standing right in front of the donor the whole time. That's one of the advantages because we don't have the privacy concerns that are inherent with urine testing. The donor and the administrator are face-to-face, virtually face-to-face the entire collection process. And so it's not possible for somebody to switch out one oral fluid sample with another, to use any of the typical products or devices that they would normally use that you can find lots of information on the internet, to dilute a sample, to switch a sample, et cetera. Just doesn't work when it comes to oral fluid testing. And I talked to the observed collection process. One of the things that we'll have to look at is, what state drug testing laws, outside of federally mandated programs, what state drug testing laws allow or do not allow observed collection. The vast majority of states are silent on the issue, and most states simply defer to the federal government's regulations for drug testing when it comes to collection protocols, chain of custody, observed collections, split specimens, et cetera. So I don't think that's going to be a major issue, but it will be something when, if you're using 49 CFR Part 40's guidelines for oral fluid testing in the future, you're going to want to make sure that there's no conflict with any of the state laws that apply to you. I think it's going to be very rare that there is a conflict, if at all. I talked about the collection time and its impact on productivity. The Federal Register, or the proposed guidelines in the Federal Register, had a lot of information on this. I won't take a lot of time with it now, but the amount of time that it takes to do an oral fluid test is simply, a lot less than with the traditional urine test, and that has a direct impact on the cost of a drug test. When you look at the cost of drug testing, you have to be, completely honest about the situation and realize that, it's not simply what you pay for a drug test. It's a lot of other things that have to do with the cost of administering a drug testing program. In particular, the time away from work, the TAW. So when an employee gets notified that they must leave their job duties and come and provide a sample, how long do you want them to be away from their from their work duties? Do you want them to be away 15 to 20 minutes, or do you want them to be gone anywhere from an hour to 4 hours, according to the federal government's estimate? And of course, the longer they're away, the greater the impact on productivity and the more expensive the drug test actually becomes. So let's say you're paying $30. I'm just picking a number out of the air. You're paying $30 for a drug test, but a $30 an hour employee is away from work for 3 hours to provide a urine sample at an offsite collection. You're tacking on another $90. And if it's a post-accident or reasonable suspicion test, you're sending a supervisor along with that person who maybe is making $50 an hour, and so now you've added another $150 to the actual cost that you as an employer are incurring by having that type of testing program. When the employees off-site are away from their job for 15 to 20 minutes, there's a considerable savings there. And that was all right there in the proposed guidelines from the federal government. Another thing that they really highlighted in the proposed guidelines was the ability to detect recent use of a drug after somebody's used it with oral fluid versus a urine sample. You know, and I've got a chart coming up on the window of detection when it comes to the different testing specimens, and so I'll hold off on that until I have an opportunity to show you that slide. It's coming up in just Let me kind of go past this just a little bit. There, a little technical difficulty. Okay, so we're going to provide a lot of information on all of the federal government's comments, and I know I kind of breezed through that, but I want to kind of get to a certain point time-wise so I can bring Dennis into the conversation. Let me talk about just a few of the common myths that still linger when it comes to oral fluid testing. And I base this on a lot of information that, as a company, we derive from our annual survey of the drug testing industry. Despite the fact that there's a ton of information out there to the contrary, and that the federal government actually put a lot of good, accurate, updated information into those proposed guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing, there are still some people who are under the impression that lab-based oral fluid testing is not as accurate as urine testing, that the window of detection is too short to provide a reliable result, that you can't detect marijuana in an oral fluid sample, that it's just as susceptible to cheating as with urine, and that it's just too complicated to make the switch from urine testing to oral fluid testing. And the fact of the matter is there's a very logical response to all of these different myths, and I'm going to take you through just a few of them to kind of set the stage for bringing Dennis into the conversation. When it comes to accuracy, we want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples, right? So accuracy is can be measured in drug test results, comparing a result from an oral fluid test with the result from a urine test, if possibly even, and there have been studies done where they've shown, a sample of oral fluid taken from the same donor that they took a urine sample from, and, what percentage over the course of hundreds of samples collected were the same with the oral fluid sample and the urine sample. But the truth of the matter is, you're going to get some positives with oral fluid testing that you just can't get with urine, and vice versa. And that's because with oral fluid testing, you're able to detect both the parent drug and the metabolite of the drug. And so, and for that reason, as soon as if there's drug in the bloodstream, then it's going to be detectable with an oral fluid sample. Whereas there's a time period in which the drug metabolizes in the donor system before it's detectable in a urine sample. So because of that, most drugs are detectable in an oral fluid sample almost immediately after the individual has used the drug. Let me give you a scenario. Somebody is out in the parking lot during their lunch break, and they come back into work reeking of marijuana. Well, if you take an oral fluid sample from that individual right then, there's a high likelihood that that person is going to test positive for marijuana if, in fact, they were using marijuana and that's why they smelled marijuana. However, if you take a urine sample at the same time, because the drug use occurred in the last, say, 10 or 15 minutes, it's not going to have metabolized that quickly so that there's a detection of the drug in a urine sample. You're going to get a positive with an oral fluid, and you're not going to get a positive with the urine sample for at least an hour or longer So by comparison, you're getting positives on the front end of that quote-unquote window of detection that you're not going to get with urine. The window of detection stays open a little bit less time with oral fluid testing than with urine, so you're going to get some positives on the other end of the window of detection. And let me just fast forward, if I could, to a slide that I have coming up that shows the window of detection. It goes with another part of the presentation, but fits well right here as well. So as you can see, you've got blood, oral fluid, urine, and then off to the right there, the brown section is hair. What this indicates is that the window of detection for blood and oral fluid opens up almost immediately after the individual has used the drug, and there's a lag time of about an hour or so before the drug is detectable in a urine sample. However, on the other end of the window of detection, as you look a little bit over to the right, you can see that it closes sooner with oral fluid than with urine. Now, there are people out there making the argument that with urine you can detect drugs in somebody's system for 30 days. Well, that's true to some extent, but at the cutoff levels that we use, you're only going to have a window of detection somewhere between 3, 4, maybe 5 days. With oral fluid, you're looking at 24 hours, depending on the drug, depending on lots of different factors, how much the individual uses drugs and how often they use drugs and things of that nature. You're going to have a shorter window of detection. So you're going to get some positives on the front end of that window of detection with oral fluid. You're going to get some positives on the other end with urine. And so they sort of offset each other. So that when you look at the positivity rates with oral fluid testing versus urine testing, you can see that they're very similar. And in some cases, the positivity rate with lab-based oral fluid testing, which is that middle column under the word intercept, are actually a little bit higher. So comparing, this was actually, if you look down there, near over 4.5 million drug test samples. If you compare the two, amphetamine was the only drug category where urine had a higher positivity rate. All the other ones, including THC, right? That's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, including THC, all the others were higher with lab-based oral fluid testing. And in the end, the overall positivity was 4.1 for lab-based oral fluid testing and 4.4 for urine testing. The point being that the positivity rates are offset, the one versus the other, by the positives you get at the front end of the window of detection with lab-based oral fluid testing and those that you get on the other end of the window of detection with urine testing. If you're concerned about recent use, though, somebody going out into the parking lot and using drugs on their lunch break or their coffee break, et cetera, or you're concerned about, let's say, for example, you're in one of the states that's legalized marijuana, say Colorado, for example, and you're concerned about having too wide a window of detection when you do drug testing and getting marijuana positives for people who are going to claim that they used the drug 4 or 5 days ago, and what right do you have to know that when marijuana is legal in Colorado? Well, with oral fluid testing, if they test positive, they use the drug within the last day, probably within the last, say 8 to 12 hours. And so if they were involved in an accident, it's very possible, according to many scientific studies that have been done, that that individual is still under the influence of marijuana 6 hours later, 8 hours later, et cetera, and could still be impaired sometime down the road when that accident occurred that triggered the drug test, or when that aberrant behavior occurred in the workplace that triggered the drug test. So all of those things to take into consideration when you're talking about the window of detection, because it's a major issue, and for a lot of people, it's something that is misunderstood, but it's something that's easily sort of understood if you know the difference on the front end of the window with the difference on the back end of the window, urine versus oral fluid. I do want to point out that with hair testing, there's a lag time of about a week before the drug is detectable in that hair sample, but then that window of detection is going to stay open for a long time, up to 90 days, depending on a number of different factors. Okay, so let me go back and just catch up just a couple of things, and then I'm ready to turn it over to Dennis. Actually, let me go back here. Just as far as accuracy, regardless of what product or testing method you're looking at, but certainly with lab-based oral fluid testing, you want to use a product that has independent empirical data from peer-reviewed journals that can back up all accuracy claims. You don't want to rely on marketing material from a company. You want to see independent studies that have been done using that product. You're going to want an FDA-cleared device because when those final guidelines come out from the federal government, it's only going to allow the use of FDA-cleared collection devices and assays in the laboratory, the actual drugs you're going to test for. You can always ask for referrals to talk to other people who are in your particular line of work who are using the product, see what they say. And you can also do your own internal research. Ask for some sample product, take out the package insert, read it, see what the claims are, and then use the product over the course of several weeks and find out for yourself if it's easy to use, if the time away from work is decreased by not sending people off-site collection sites. Know who you're doing business with and know the product that you're going to be using, because that's going to make a big difference when it comes to whether or not you're going to be happy with this drug testing product. Now, one last thing before I bring Dennis in. I said I would talk a little bit about drug test cheating. There's a lot of good information in the slide deck today about drug test cheating. I'm going to leave most of it for you to review, but the fact of the matter is there's just not that much out there that anybody can, even hope to use that would help them successfully cheat on an oral fluid drug test. If they've got drugs in their system, they're going to get caught. And one of the ways that we know that is if you do an internet search on beat the drug test or cheat the drug test or any number of terms like that, you're going to come up with literally hundreds of thousands of potential websites that you can visit. Only a handful of them say anything at all about oral fluid testing. But one of my favorites, and I've got them quoted here, says, try to avoid the test. In other words, if you've got drugs in your system and you're going to be tested with oral fluid the next day, their advice is avoid the test. If one is being tested and is used in the past 3 days, you will need to overcome the saliva collection. In other words, don't even let them have your saliva. Avoid submitting a saliva sample. And then at the bottom, to pass this, an oral fluid test, you should always know the detection time of the drug you've taken. Marijuana can be detected via saliva drug testing from an hour after ingestion, it's really within minutes, up to 24 hours depending on use. Between these periods of time, you must avoid being screened or you will surely test positive. The best advice that I've ever seen for getting away with using drugs if you're going to be tested with oral fluid is to avoid the test. Or, as some websites actually claim, buy our shampoo product to rinse your hair out and stop using drugs for at least 3 days before you get tested. So in other words, this shampoo is bogus, it's not going to work. If you really want to pass this oral fluid test, just make sure you stop using drugs for 3 or 4 days before you're tested. Now, over many, many years, I've had the pleasure of working with Dennis, and Dennis joined the Current Consulting Group a little over a year ago, and he's had extensive experience professionally working with companies that have decided to use lab-based oral fluid testing. Probably from a practical standpoint, one of the premier experts on this topic. And I thought it'd be great to bring Dennis in at this point and have him talk a little bit about his experience, and then I've got some questions I want to ask. So, Jessica, let's make sure we unmute Dennis's phone and bring him into the conversation. I still see his phone is muted. Okay, perfect. Dennis, are you there?
I am.
Wonderful. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Tell us a little bit about your experience in the drug testing industry as it pertains to lab-based oral fluid testing.
Originally, Lab 1 had, I believe, an exclusive with Intercept for the first couple of years that oral fluid was introduced, and the TPA I worked with at the time was one of the pilot TPAs to introduce oral fluid testing. So we began with it a couple of years before anyone else had done any oral fluid testing. So it was brand new. Nobody'd ever heard about it. There wasn't the federal guidelines to back it up. It was a little difficult. The attractive part at that point was remote locations where there were no collection sites available, and you wanted to do drug testing, say, for instance, pipelines or the North Slope of Alaska, places that they didn't at that time have access to. The oral fluid was a method of providing drug testing without a trained collection site or a professional collection site. So that was the attractive part there. Then as things progress, more and more people are interested in, well, I want to know that this drug actually affected the accident, or the time window things you talked about, even becoming a bigger thing now that several states have legalized marijuana for recreational use. Employers want to, have a shorter window of detection and be able to base it on, yes, this was a contributing factor to the accident or the behavior that we observed. And that's where I think I agree with the boom that's coming now that we have solid guidelines and cutoff levels, and they've been validated by the federal government and SAMHSA. Oral fluid is attractive that way. The one thing that was a deterrent originally is oral fluid drug tests at the laboratory cost more money. But the truth is, like Bill pointed out, if you look at the overall cost of the drug test, the downtime, the lost time from work, it really is considerably cheaper than doing a urine-based drug test. So early on, that was a very difficult concept to sell to companies, that it was, the drug test cost $10 more at the laboratory, but overall it's cheaper. They didn't really believe that. But, if people are getting more educated on what drug testing actually costs them, and the downtime, the time that their employees are away from the job site, has definitely become an issue. The other thing where it was really advantageous was the fact that collectors that went on site to remote work sites, oil sand sites or drilling sites, there may not have been a proper restroom. I've heard some horror stories about, collection being done 30 below out behind the back. But oral fluid alleviated that problem, and you could do an oral fluid collection without, proper restroom facilities. So companies are switching to lab-based oral fluid, and I'm seeing it more in the states with legalized marijuana. They want to be able to stand behind their drug tests and say, look, you were using, and it wasn't 3 weeks, it was within the last 24 hours. And I think that's going to become a bigger issue as more and more states legalize marijuana, which I foresee happening. And companies prefer oral-based testing over instant. Instant oral fluid hasn't technically made it there yet. If you look at the cutoff levels, I think there's one device that's FDA cleared, and the cutoff level was like 40 nanograms for marijuana, when lab-based oral fluid is 4. So the sensitivity isn't there to be able to test at the lower levels that are, determined to be applicable.
Yeah, Dennis, I just put a slide up on the screen. I had this just in case we wanted to use it today, but this shows the positivity rates at different cutoff levels. And what Dennis is referring to there is you can see the vertical red dotted line is at about 50 nanograms per milliliter. Everything below it, in those lower registers, are where the vast majority of the positives come from. And if you're using an instant testing device with a cutoff level of 40 or 50 nanograms, you're not going to get a lot of positives because, as Dennis mentioned, the positives are really on the lower end of that register, as you can see there, and you're only going to get those from lab-based oral fluid testing versus instant oral fluid testing. Is that kind of accurate to say it that way, Dennis?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point I was trying to make. That's a good depiction. The other thing, when I worked in Canada for several years, and the building trades group there wrote into their contracts, into their union agreements, that oral fluid be the only type of testing used for post-accident or reasonable cause, which was kind of a shock initially, but it does have, the reason being the detection window, and there's a strong belief out there that, if you're positive on an oral fluid, then you've recently been using, where the feeling with urine is, especially with marijuana, is, well, it was 3 weeks ago, so it couldn't have impacted my action on the job. So that was kind of the first time I saw that as being written into union agreements. I haven't seen that in any of the unions in the U.S., but oral fluid testing in Canada was brought in with that and increased because of that. And I think that they may be ahead of the U.S. as far as implementation of that. And, the unions in Canada and the unions in the U.S. are in the same international brotherhood. So the thinking and the reasoning behind that, I think, will be transferred to the U.S. also.
One of the things, just to remind our audience, Dennis worked, he helped start a very well-known TPA here in the United States, and they started a Canadian operation, which eventually, to put it in simple terms, spun off and became its own company, and Dennis went to work for the company in Canada called Can-Am. And also through Can-Am, Dennis, if I understand all of it correctly, you actually did drug testing in Ireland, was it, and other European countries? How far-reaching was it?
We did several European countries through Can-Am when they were recruiting labor when the oil prices were up and there wasn't enough labor for the oil sand sites in Alberta. The companies were recruiting foreign workers, especially welders and things out of Ireland. And so Can-Am was instrumental in helping them set up guidelines and things to get the testing done in their home country before they were transported to Canada. So you wouldn't want to transport somebody from Ireland and then they fail the drug test and you have to send them back. So, it was a lesson in learning how to be flexible. We have pretty stringent guidelines and everybody understands the DOT guidelines. But when you're dealing in a foreign country, you need to be aware of the privacy laws, like having an MRO in the U.S. and a person being tested in Ireland. When you transmit that MRO copy across international guidelines, across international borders, there are a multitude of privacy laws that you probably just violated. So, you need to be aware, and that's what we did. We set up programs that as close and acceptable for testing to get the accomplishment of the goal was to bring drug-free workers to Canada. So, they may have had a little different cutoff levels. Their laboratories obviously aren't SAMHSA certified, but there's an international European certification. There are MROs that are trained by U.S. DOT guidelines in foreign countries, and we contracted with an MRO that was well aware of the guidelines that did the MRO work. Even the paper filing and the method, like in Ireland, the MRO is responsible for the paperwork, and it has to all be destroyed within 6 months of the test. So, there are different twists and turns that you need to understand when you're dealing in foreign countries.
And one of the things I'm saying to the audience, Dennis, one of the things I've learned from Dennis over the years, because of his extensive international experience, is that in other countries, as he mentioned, they don't necessarily have or go by the United States Department of Transportation regulations. And so in some instances, that's a positive thing in that they're sort of more advanced, if you will, when it comes to advanced or alternative testing methods, oral fluid testing being one of them. And when you were in Canada, Dennis, obviously well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in the many times that you and I have spoken and the oral fluid and the Canadian policies that we worked on together, it seems to me, if I'm saying this correctly, the unions really sort of have a big say in things like you've already mentioned, but on a province-by-province basis, it could change from one province to the next, correct?
That's absolutely correct. I think the western provinces, BC, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, are more drug testing friendly. Ontario is not drug testing friendly, very strong union presence. There's been several Supreme Court cases where they struck down pre-access testing, and they say that there's not enough data to show that it's necessary. Random testing's been shot down a couple times. From the union perspective, although some point they'll get there, because I still don't believe that from seeing programs with random versus programs without, I don't believe you can have a real drug testing program without random. But they've been proposed several times. The Alberta government came up with a program, a pilot program, to collect data on random testing, and one of the unions fought that and got it stopped. But sooner or later, the data will just catch up, and you can look at the Canadian positive rates from DOT, which I think it was 96 that I started working in Canada, and the positive rates in DOT were around 4% positive. They're well less than 1% now. So random testing proved efficient in that arena. It would also be efficient in the non-DOT areas like construction and oil sands and things like that.
And because of the union's significant influence in Canada and their more accepting attitude toward lab-based oral fluid testing, especially when we're talking about, as you mentioned, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, or for cause, you see a connection there. And for companies, any of you who are on today's webinar who are dealing with unions and trying to get, your unions to agree to certain types of drug testing, I think what we learned from Dennis's experience in Canada in dealing with unions quite a bit is that as they understand the benefits and the value of lab-based oral fluid testing, the security of a lab-based result with some of the other benefits like the observed collection not being an invasion of privacy, not having to collect a urine sample, things of that nature, you'll find that U.S.-based unions will be perhaps more open-minded to some of the drug testing that you may want to do. And we've seen that happen here in the U.S. We were dealing with a company just recently doing their policy where they were going to be adding random drug testing to their program here in the United States because the union was willing to allow random testing if the company did oral fluid testing. And so, I'm not saying that happens every day, but there's perhaps a connection there that Dennis has experienced in Canada that may be, similar to what could possibly happen here in the United States. And to some extent, we've kind of seen a little bit of that also. Let me just take our audience to just a couple of slides. I'm not going to go into detail on these, but I want you to know they're here. These next few slides are from the proposed guidelines that appeared in the Federal Register back in May of last year that just look at the projections of drug tests that will convert to lab-based oral fluid testing. And this slide shows the conversion, what they believe will be the conversion from urine testing to oral fluid testing in the federal government. And so DOT and NRC, which mandate drug testing of employers in the private sector who are engaged in different safety-sensitive occupations under DOT and NRC, they're projecting that, that there's going to be a fairly significant, if you think about it, conversion rate. They're saying over about a course of 4 years, it'll plateau out at about 25 to 30% of all regulated drug testing switching to lab-based oral fluid testing, nearly 2 million tests. And so that's actually quite a bit. If you're considering it, if you're talking to clients, if you're providers on the phone today, but if you're an employer that's considering it, it's not that difficult to envision how you would convert your program from a urine testing program to a lab-based oral fluid testing program. Some fairly easy steps to follow to make that possible. But key among those steps is to make sure that, one, you're dealing with a product that is FDA cleared, that's going to be acceptable in a situation where you may be legally challenged. That doesn't happen very often on the accuracy and the science of drug testing anymore, as opposed to the early days when Dennis and I first got into the drug testing business. But you're going to want to make sure that if under any circumstances that should happen, that you're dealing with an FDA-cleared device. Not only the collection device itself, that's one thing, and that's important. We want to make sure the assays that you're testing in the laboratory, you're dealing with a laboratory that can test FDA-cleared assays. And so nowadays, that old-fashioned 5-panel drug test with marijuana, cocaine, opiates, amphetamines, and PCP is really sort of becoming a thing of the past. Even the federal government is expanding the panel of drugs with these proposed guidelines that will include lab-based oral fluid testing to include the oxys and hydros, some of these synthetic opiates, to expand this window of detection that's part of the federal drug panel. Because if you're going to have a drug-free workplace program, one thing Dennis said is you really need to be doing random testing, but in addition to that, you need to be testing for the drugs that people are using. And nowadays, with greater frequency, and I don't have a slide on it today, but I could show you a study from the federal government that came out last year that shows that the number 2 category of drug abuse in the United States, of illicit drug abuse after marijuana, is now prescription drugs. The hydrocodones and the oxycodones, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're going to really have a drug-free workplace, you've got to test for the drugs that people are using, and you want to make sure that those assays are cleared in the lab, or they're FDA cleared, so that you've got the assurance that these drugs that you're testing for are actually FDA cleared in the laboratory. There's a number of other things that you need to do to make sure that the program's in place. Key among them also is to make sure your supervisors are trained properly, and anybody who's going to be doing the collections on site could be trained employees and supervisors, maybe people from the HR department, from the medical department, et cetera. But if you're using a product like the OraSure Intercept device or through AWSI, you're going to find that they provide that training, so that if you want to use your employees to do that, which is a very simple thing to do, it's not complicated at all like it is with urine testing. It's very simple to do. And the training just takes actually just, a half an hour to go through that and learn how to do that. And you're going to want to make sure that you do that, so that not only are those supervisors following all the proper collection procedures, filling out the proper paperwork, because you're still going to want to do chain of custody, et cetera, but that they've been trained with that particular collection device that you're using and the laboratory that you're going to be sending. Question about, and I can take this one, are there any states that do not allow oral fluid testing? If we're talking about lab-based oral fluid testing, there are 3 states that we're concerned about right now: Vermont, Maine, and Hawaii. Let me just say, as far as Maine goes, that they have already signaled that they will be allowing lab-based oral fluid testing using these federal guidelines as their protocols once they're finalized. So Maine will drop off the list later this year when those federal guidelines are finalized. With Hawaii, they actually do allow point of collection or instant result oral fluid testing right now. I'm not exactly sure why they don't allow lab-based oral fluid testing. Again, with a lot of state laws, if you read the laws carefully, you'll find that they simply defer to the federal government when it comes to drug testing procedures and protocols. What lab to use, whether you can do observed collections, what chain of custody form should you use. Many state drug testing laws do not include that kind of detailed information, and they'll simply defer to the federal government. And so in one law, they may be talking about the SAMHSA guidelines. Another one might refer to 49 CFR Part 40. Another one, like in Illinois, they refer to the DOT regulations. And some even refer to NIDA still, which is sort of an ancient term from the old days of drug testing. But I think once these final guidelines come out, I think you'll see Vermont, and Hawaii both allow lab-based oral fluid testing sometime in the near future. Maine has already indicated that they will. Now, to answer the question more completely, if you were talking about instant result oral fluid testing, there would be a number of states where you couldn't do that because they don't allow the use of instant test devices, like in Minnesota, for example. There's a list of them, but Minnesota would be an example of a state that requires all drug tests to be done at a laboratory. And so whether it was oral fluid or urine, you couldn't do instant testing in that state. And there are a number of states like that. Not a lot, but a few. And so you'd want to check that to make sure. But there's a big difference between lab-based oral fluid testing and instant result oral fluid testing, both in terms of the process and the results and the cutoff levels like Dennis was talking about, as well as the various state laws that apply. Another couple of questions here. In urine, you can collect split specimens, split samples. How do you address this with oral fluid testing? That's a good question. I'll take a first stab at it, Dennis. Maybe you've got some insight as well. But as part of those proposed guidelines from the federal government, there were different options for continuing to have a split specimen protocol. It definitely will be part of the final guidelines when they come out. And whether or not you're going to collect 2 samples at the same time with different devices, or if you're going to have a device that can split an oral fluid sample or saliva sample into two containers at the same time. And so there were lots of different comments on that. I'm not exactly sure what the final regulations are going to show. There are more questions. We're pretty much out of time. We did start late, so let me take one last question for those who are hanging in there. I know we've had very few people drop off so far. What about alcohol testing? Would employers still need to conduct urine or breath tests for alcohol? I will say that saliva testing is one of the approved testing methods for alcohol testing under the DOT regulations, for example. And you have to use a product that's on what's called the conforming products list, which is put out by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration from NHTSA. And I know of at least one saliva test, the QED, which is made by OraSure, that is an approved saliva testing device right now. So absent all of this, you could collect a saliva sample for your drug test and a saliva sample for your alcohol test using the QED device or something like it, and still be in compliance with, eventually with DOT regulations once they adopt lab-based oral fluid testing. But I was thinking more along the lines of various state drug testing laws. There are very few state laws when it comes to workplace testing that do not permit saliva alcohol testing. I'm not, maybe Minnesota, I know they require blood there. The Florida Workers' Comp Premium Discount Law requires blood alcohol testing, but I'd be hard-pressed to name a state that doesn't allow saliva alcohol testing under general circumstances. How did you deal with that, Dennis? You probably did a lot of breath testing, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's true, but the sad thing with the alcohol is definitely a problem in the workplace. The problem with alcohol testing is delivery, because when you transport somebody to a collection site for a breath alcohol test, the half-life of alcohol is so short that you can have somebody that's positive on the work site and negative when they get to the collection center. So, and some type of immediate alcohol test, companies I've dealt with that do have safety people or somebody doing on-site breath testing, their positive rates are much higher than they are when they're transported to a collection center. So this might be another means to really pick out the alcohol problem.
Thank you, Dennis. We're out of time, folks. Let me just thank OraSure Technologies again and AWSI for co-sponsoring today's webinar. I also want to thank my co-presenter, Dennis Kearns, for the great insights that he provided. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to now turn it over to Jessica, who's going to tell you how you can get the copy of today's slides and the recordings from today's presentation.
Thank you so much, Bill and Dennis. And on behalf of OraSure Technologies and AWSI, we hope you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded and you will receive instructions informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.